Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet corner of the evening, where stories unfold like mist across a midnight garden. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight, to this space designed for rest, for gentle mystery, and for the kind of peace that comes when we allow ourselves to drift into tales that whisper rather than shout. Tonight's journey takes us to Victorian London, to the familiar rooms of 221B Baker Street, where the great detective Sherlock Holmes awaits us on Christmas Eve, and where a mystery as delicate as snowfall and as haunting as church bells heard across frozen fields will slowly reveal itself to us. This story is crafted to help you release the tensions of your day, to slow your racing thoughts, and to carry you gently toward the shores of sleep, while we unravel together a puzzle wrapped in fog and firelight. Before we begin, I'm curious, though you needn't answer aloud, from where in this wide world are you listening tonight? Perhaps from a city where rain taps against your window, as it does in our story, or from somewhere warm where you seek the coolness of an English winter through imagination alone. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. In this moment, we share across time and distance. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The fire in the hearth of 221B Baker Street crackled softly, sending sparks upward into the darkness of the chimney, like tiny stars returning to their celestial homes. Outside, London lay wrapped in the peculiar silence that descends upon a great city on Christmas Eve, when even the most hurried souls pause in their endless rushing and remember, however briefly, that the world once moved at the pace of candlelight and falling snow. The rain that had been threatening all afternoon had finally begun, not a harsh downpour, but rather a gentle, persistent whisper against the window panes, each droplet contributing its small voice to the symphony of the winter night. Dr. John Watson sat in his customary chair, a book open upon his lap, though his eyes had long since ceased their movement across the page. Instead, he found himself mesmerized by the dancing flames, by the way the firelight cast ever-shifting shadows across the cluttered sitting room, transforming the familiar space into something from a dream, recognizable yet somehow enchanted. The room smelled of many things, of the tobacco that Holmes favored, its scent clinging to the Persian slipper where it was kept, of the lemon oil Mrs. Hudson used on the furniture during her weekly ministrations, of the leather bindings of countless books, and most pleasantly at this moment, of the tea that steamed gently in the china cup balanced upon the arm of Watson's chair. Sherlock Holmes himself stood at the window, his tall, lean figure silhouetted against the pale glow of the gas lamps that illuminated Baker Street below. He had been motionless for quite some time, so long in fact that Watson had begun to wonder if his friend had somehow achieved a state of waking meditation, a conscious hibernation that allowed him to conserve his considerable mental energies during these quiet periods between cases. The detective wore his mouse-coloured dressing gown, and his long fingers were steepled beneath his sharp chin, in that characteristic gesture Watson had witnessed 1,000 times, always preceding some particularly brilliant deduction or observation. Watson smiled, long accustomed to these demonstrations. "You've caught me, Holmes, though I confess it's nothing I can quite articulate. Merely the sense that something is approaching, like the feeling in the air before a storm, though the storm has already begun." He gestured toward the rain-touched windows. Holmes turned from his vigil, and the firelight caught his aquiline features, casting them in warm gold and deep shadow. Your instincts have always been sound, my dear fellow, perhaps more sound than you credit them. The storm you sense, however, is not meteorological in nature. He moved toward his own chair with that peculiar grace he possessed, every movement economical and purposeful. I have been observing a rather interesting phenomenon this past hour. A cab has circled our street no fewer than 6 times. Its passenger visible only as a shadowed figure behind the rain-streaked window. Each time it approaches our door, it slows considerably, and each time it continues past without stopping. Someone wishes to consult us, but cannot quite summon the courage or resolve to complete the action. Watson set his book aside entirely now, his interest genuinely piqued. A potential client wrestling with doubt or fear, Holmes added quietly, settling into his chair and reaching for his pipe. The ritual of filling and lighting it provided a gentle rhythm to the conversation. The soft rustle of tobacco, the scratch of the match, the first aromatic exhalations curling upward to join the smoke from the fireplace. I suspect we shall not wait much longer to discover which. If my calculations are correct, based on the pattern of passes, the cab should be making its 7th approach in approximately... He paused, his head tilting slightly, as if listening to sounds beyond Watson's perception. Now. And indeed, as if summoned by the detective's words, the sound of horse hoofs on wet cobblestones grew gradually louder, accompanied by the particular creaking of a cab's wheels that had seen years of service upon London's unforgiving streets. This time, however, the sounds ceased directly below their window. Moments passed, moments filled with the fire's whisper, the rain's gentle percussion, and the distant tolling of a church bell marking the hour. Then came the knock upon the door below, tentative at first, barely audible, then with greater conviction. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps could be heard ascending from her quarters, the opening of the front door, and the brief murmur of voices too low to distinguish individual words. Finally, her familiar tread upon the stairs, each creaking board a note in a song Watson knew by heart. She appeared in their doorway, a small card upon a silver tray, her expression carrying that particular mixture of curiosity and concern that appeared whenever late-night visitors arrived bearing mysteries. "Gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's most urgent, though he seems..." She hesitated, searching for the appropriate word. "Troubled, sir. Quite troubled indeed." Holmes took the card, examined it briefly, and nodded. "Please show him up, Mrs. Hudson, and perhaps some fresh tea. I suspect our guest has been circling in the cold for quite some time, and will benefit from warming." As their landlady descended once more, Holmes passed the card to Watson. The name inscribed there read, Reverend Thomas Blackwood, St. Dunstan's Church, Ravenswood, Sussex. The cardstock was of good quality, but showed signs of age and much handling, and the script itself possessed that peculiar character of a man educated well, but long accustomed to modest circumstances. "A country parson," Watson observed, "from Sussex, quite a journey on Christmas Eve." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, "and notice, if you will, the slight tremor in certain letters. The writer's hand was unsteady when this was written, suggesting either advanced age, illness, or acute nervous distress." Given the evident quality of education and the traditional nature of the script, I would lean toward the latter. Whatever has brought Reverend Blackwood to London on this of all nights has shaken him considerably. The footsteps upon the stairs this time were heavier, though still hesitant. The tread of a man uncertain of his welcome, or, perhaps of his own judgment in coming. When the figure appeared in the doorway, Watson felt an immediate surge of professional concern. The Reverend Thomas Blackwood was a man of perhaps 60 years, of medium height and spare build, dressed in clerical black that had seen better days, but remained scrupulously clean and carefully brushed. His face was pale, not merely from the cold, but with the pallor of sleepless nights and consuming worry, and his eyes, grey as the winter sea, held a haunted quality that sat uncomfortably with the season's promise of peace and joy. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice cultured but weary, carrying the softest traces of a Sussex accent beneath his clerical pronunciation. "Dr. Watson, I apologize most profusely for this intrusion upon your Christmas Eve. I have circled your residence several times, unable to decide whether my concerns warrant disturbing you during such a time. I fear you may think me foolish, or worse, a man whose nerves have overcome his reason." Holmes rose and extended his hand, his manner warm and reassuring. That particular gentleness he could summon when dealing with those in genuine distress. "Please, Reverend Blackwood, think nothing of it. Christmas Eve or not, mysteries do not observe the calendar, and from your manner I deduce that you have encountered something that has genuinely disturbed you. Come, sit by the fire. Mrs. Hudson is bringing fresh tea, and once you are warmed, you may tell us your story in whatever fashion suits you best. There is no judgment here, only curiosity and, I hope, assistance." The clergyman moved toward the chair Holmes indicated, and as he settled into it, his body seemed to release some great tension it had been carrying. Mrs. Hudson arrived with the promised tea, the gentle clink of china, and the aromatic steam, providing a moment of ordinary comfort in what was clearly becoming an extraordinary evening. Watson poured for their guest, noting how the man's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the cup, not the tremor of age or palsy, but of genuine fear held barely in check. "I hardly know where to begin," Blackwood said, after taking a grateful sip of the warming liquid. "The events I must relate sound impossible even to my own ears, and I am the one who has experienced them. I am the vicar of St. Dunstan's Church in the village of Ravenswood, a position I have held for 32 years. It is a small parish, Mr. Holmes, perhaps 300 souls, situated in a quiet corner of Sussex, where little of note has occurred since the Conquest. The church itself is ancient, Norman foundations with Saxon remnants incorporated into the structure, additions from every subsequent century creating a kind of architectural palimpsest. It has stood for nearly 900 years, weathering wars and plagues, reforms and restorations, always remaining the spiritual heart of our little community." He paused, staring into his teacup as if seeking answers in its amber depths. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the rain continued its gentle rhythm against the windows. 3 weeks ago, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, the bells began to ring. Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes, who had settled back into his chair, his fingers again forming that characteristic steeple, his eyes never leaving their visitor's face. "On the surface," Blackwood went on, "this would seem unremarkable. Church bells ring, it is their purpose. However, these rings occur at 3 o'clock in the morning, every morning without fail, for these past 21 days. St. Dunstan's has 6 bells in its tower, ranging from the great tenor bell, which weighs nearly a ton, and whose voice can be heard for 5 miles on a clear day, to the smallest treble, whose bright voice is like birdsong. During these nocturnal ringings, all 6 sound together in a pattern that is not any of our traditional changes. Not plain hunt, not grandsire, not anything in the standard repertoire. It is something other, something I have never heard in more than 3 decades of ministry. He set his teacup down with a soft clink that seemed loud in the attentive silence. But here is the impossibility, gentlemen. The church is locked. I have the only keys. The bell chamber is secured by a door that has not been opened in years, as the bells are rung from below by ropes that descend to the ringing chamber. Yet, when I rush to the church each night, awakened by those inexplicable peals, I find everything secured, everything in its proper place. The bell ropes hang motionless. There is no one present, and yet the bells continue their eerie music from the tower high above, a music that brings no joy, but rather fills the heart with an inexplicable melancholy, a profound sense of something lost or mourned. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly engaged. Have others heard these bells, or is the phenomenon isolated to yourself? The entire village hears them, Blackwood replied. Indeed, that is partly what drove me to seek your help. At first, the villagers were merely puzzled. Strange, they said, but perhaps there was some natural explanation. As the nights have continued, however, and as I have been unable to provide any rational accounting, fear has begun to take root. People who have attended services for decades now look at me with suspicion, as if I am somehow responsible for this haunting. Attendance has fallen. I have heard whispers of the church being cursed, of ancient sins coming home to demand reckoning. Mrs. Thornbury, our oldest parishioner at 93 years, claims the bells sound exactly as they did when she was a girl, on the night the previous vicar disappeared under mysterious circumstances. But that was 70 years ago, and I can find no records of such an event. Watson, unable to contain his curiosity, asked, "Have you investigated the bell tower itself? Examined the bells and their mechanisms for any sign of tampering or unusual apparatus?" "I have, Doctor," Blackwood affirmed with a weary nod. "Multiple times. I have brought our village blacksmith, our carpenter, even Lord Pemberton from the manor house, as he has some engineering knowledge from his time in India. None of us can discover any mechanism that might account for the phenomenon. The bells themselves show no sign of recent handling. They are covered in the dust of years, with spider webs spanning the gaps between bell and wheel. The crown staples show no unusual wear. It is as if they ring by ghostly hands, or by no hands at all, responding to some invisible force or command." Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window once more, though Watson suspected he was looking not at the street below, but inward, toward the architecture of the problem itself. The rain had intensified slightly, and the sound provided a soothing backdrop to their contemplation. "You mentioned that Mrs. Thornbury recalled a similar occurrence," Holmes said, still facing the window. "Tell me more about this previous vicar and his disappearance." Blackwood's cup rattled slightly as he lifted it once more. The tea seemed to be providing him with both warmth and courage to continue. His name was Reverend Edmund Grail. He came to Ravenswood in 1793, according to the parish records, which makes his tenure begin over a century ago. He served for 7 years, by all accounts a dedicated, if somewhat scholarly parson, more interested in his books and in the history of the church than in the social aspects of ministry. Then, in the winter of 1800, he simply vanished. His rooms were found undisturbed, his possessions all in place, but the man himself was never seen again. The church records mention the disappearance only obliquely. There is a notation that Reverend Grail departed unexpectedly, and a new vicar was installed within the month. And Mrs. Thornbury claims the bells rang then as well. Watson asked, his medical mind already considering whether the elderly woman's memory could be trusted. She is quite adamant, Blackwood replied. She says the bells rang for 12 nights, and on the 13th night, Reverend Grail disappeared. She was only a young woman then, newly married, but she remembers being terrified by the sound. She says the entire village was in a state of panic, that there was talk of the church being built on pagan ground, of old gods demanding their due. Then, when Grail vanished, the bells fell silent, and the new vicar, a practical man who would brook no superstitious nonsense, brought calm and rationality back to the parish. Holmes turned from the window, his face thoughtful. You said the current ringing has continued for 21 nights, precisely 3 times 7, a number laden with significance in various traditions. Has there been any escalation in the phenomenon? Any change in pattern or intensity? Each night, the ringing lasts longer, Blackwood said, and there was genuine fear in his voice now. The first night, it was perhaps 5 minutes. Last night, it continued for nearly 20. And there is something else, something I hesitate to mention lest you truly think me mad. When the bells ring, I feel compelled to go to the church, despite the cold, despite the darkness, despite my growing fear. It is as if something is calling to me specifically, drawing me towards some revelation or confrontation, and when I stand in the nave, in the darkness, with only my lantern for illumination, I have the strongest sensation of not being alone, of being observed by presences I cannot see. He set his cup down with finality, and met Holmes's gaze directly. Tomorrow is Christmas Day, Mr. Holmes. It will also be the 22nd night. If the pattern holds, if there is any truth to Mrs. Thornbury's memories, I have 9 days before something happens. I do not know if I will disappear as Reverend Grail did, or if something else entirely is meant to occur. But I cannot ignore this sense of approaching culmination. I need your help to unravel this mystery before it reaches whatever conclusion it seems to be building toward. The fire popped suddenly, sending a shower of sparks against the guard, the sound like a small exclamation point to the Reverend's plea. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, his eyes distant, clearly organizing the various threads of the problem into his mental framework. Outside, a church bell began to toll midnight. Not the mysterious bells of Ravenswood, but the familiar peal of a London church, marking the transition from Christmas Eve to Christmas Day. When Holmes spoke, his voice carried that note of decision that Watson had heard countless times before, the tone that meant the game was afoot. Reverend Blackwood, your journey tonight was not in vain. This case presents several features of considerable interest. The apparent impossibility of the phenomenon, the historical precedent, the mathematical progression of the durations, and the psychological compulsion you describe. Dr. Watson and I will travel to Ravenswood with you. If you can secure lodgings for us, we shall arrive tomorrow, or rather, later today, and begin our investigation in earnest. Christmas Day or not, a mystery of this nature demands immediate attention. Relief washed over the clergyman's features, like dawn breaking after a long night. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Thank you more than I can adequately express. The vicarage has guest rooms that are modest but comfortable. You would be most welcome there. There is a train that departs Victoria Station at 10 o'clock that will bring us to Ravenswood by early afternoon." "Excellent," Holmes replied. "Then I suggest you repair to a hotel for what remains of the night. I can recommend the Langham, which is not far and remains open to travellers at all hours. Rest if you can, and we shall meet you at the station at 9:30. Watson, you are amenable to a Christmas spent in Sussex, rather than here in London." Watson smiled, already mentally cataloguing what he would need to pack. "You know I am, Holmes. Mrs. Hudson will be disappointed to have her Christmas goose go uneaten, but she is long accustomed to our irregular schedules." After Reverend Blackwood had departed, expressing his gratitude once more, before descending into the rainy night to find a cab that would carry him to rest and relative peace, Watson and Holmes remained by the fire. The rain had softened to a mere whisper, and the hour was late, or early, depending on one's perspective. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" Watson asked, pouring himself another cup of tea from the pot, finding it still pleasantly warm. Holmes had retrieved his pipe and was smoking contemplatively, his gaze fixed on the dying fire. "I make of it a fascinating convergence of the physical and the psychological, my dear Watson. The bells ring, that much seems certain, as they are heard by the entire village. The mechanism by which they ring, however, remains occluded. Then we have the historical element, a previous vicar vanishing under similar circumstances a century ago. Though we have only the recollection of an elderly woman to support this connection. Add to this the reverend sense of compulsion and presence, which could be entirely psychological in origin, a product of stress and sleeplessness, or could indicate something more tangible that we have not yet perceived." He paused, sending a perfect smoke ring floating toward the ceiling. "What intrigues me most is the pattern, the increasing duration, the consistent timing, the suggestion of a countdown toward some culminating event. This speaks not of random supernatural activity, if we must use such a term, but of purpose and design. Where there is design, there is an intelligence behind it, and where there is intelligence, there is the possibility of understanding and ultimately of resolution." Watson watched the smoke ring dissipate into nothingness. "Do you believe in ghosts, Holmes?" The detective's lips curved in a slight smile. "I believe in phenomena not yet adequately explained, my friend. I have learned, through our many adventures together, that the universe contains far more mysteries than our philosophies typically account for. However, I have also learned that what appears supernatural often has, upon close examination, a rational foundation, though that foundation may be hidden beneath layers of fear, superstition, and incomplete observation. Tomorrow, today, we shall apply our methods to this mystery of the phantom bells, and we shall see what emerges from the darkness into the light of understanding." They sat in companionable silence for a while longer, the fire burning down to glowing embers, the rain finally ceasing altogether, to leave London wrapped in that peculiar stillness that comes in the hours between midnight and dawn. Watson found his eyelids growing heavy, the warmth and the late hour combining to create an almost irresistible pull towards sleep. "You should rest, Watson," Holmes said softly. "We have a journey ahead of us, and I suspect the days to come will demand our full attention and energy. I shall remain here a while longer. My mind is too active for sleep at present, and I wish to consider the problem from several angles before we are immersed in it fully." Watson rose, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from sitting. "Will you at least try to rest before we must depart?" "I shall lie down for an hour or two," Holmes assured him. "That is generally sufficient for my needs. Good night, Watson, and Merry Christmas, though it promises to be anything but traditional." "Good night, Holmes. Merry Christmas." Watson retired to his room, where the familiar comfort of his bed awaited. As he drifted toward sleep, his mind replayed the evening's revelation, the image of an ancient church in the Sussex countryside, its bells ringing impossibly in the dead of night, calling out across fields and forests, their message unknown, but their summons undeniable. It was both unsettling and strangely compelling, like a story from a Gothic novel come to life. And he found himself genuinely eager to begin unraveling its secrets. Sleep came gradually, gently, like a fog rolling in from the sea, and his dreams, when they arrived, were filled with the sound of bells ringing in the darkness, their voices layered and complex, singing songs older than memory. Morning arrived, with pale winter sunlight filtering through the frost-patterned windows of Baker Street. Watson woke to find that Holmes had been true to his word. The detective was already awake and dressed, his small valise packed and waiting by the door. Mrs. Hudson, bless her, had prepared breakfast despite the early hour, and despite knowing they would be departing, leaving her alone on Christmas Day. There were kippers and eggs, toast with marmalade, and strong black coffee that helped chase away the last cobwebs of sleep. "Did you manage any rest at all?" Watson asked as they ate, noting the brightness in Holmes's eyes that suggested his mind had been working through the night. "Rest or no rest?" "Enough," Holmes replied. "I have been considering the acoustics of church bells, the mechanics of bell ringing, and the various ways one might create the illusion of impossible sound. I have also been reviewing what little I know of the history of Sussex churches and their construction. We are venturing into territory where local knowledge will be crucial. Folk memory, village lore, the accumulated wisdom of generations who have lived in proximity to these ancient stones. Often, what we dismiss as superstition contains kernels of historical truth, facts transformed through the lens of time and retelling, into something that seems fantastic, but is, at its core, a record of genuine events." They finished their meal in companionable efficiency, thanked Mrs. Hudson for her forbearance, and wished her a peaceful Christmas, and set out into the London morning. The rain had ceased entirely, leaving the streets washed clean and glistening beneath a sky that suggested snow might follow before the day was done. The city was quiet, almost contemplative, as families gathered in homes to celebrate the holiday, and the usual rush and press of urban life gave way to something gentler, more reflective. Victoria Station was not crowded. Christmas Day was not a traditional day for travel, but it was not entirely deserted either. They found Reverend Blackwood waiting near the platform where their train stood ready, steam already rising from its locomotive, like the breath of some great sleeping beast. The clergyman looked marginally better than he had the previous evening, though the shadows beneath his eyes spoke of a night where genuine rest had remained elusive despite the comfort of a hotel bed. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted them with a wan smile. "I cannot thank you enough for this. I half feared I would arrive and find you had reconsidered, that in the light of Christmas morning, my nighttime terrors would seem too fantastical to warrant your attention." Not at all, Holmes assured him. A mystery is a mystery, regardless of the calendar. Shall we board? I am eager to see Ravenswood and your church for myself. The train journey south and east towards Sussex was pleasant, despite the cold. They had secured a compartment to themselves, and as London gradually gave way to countryside, the landscape transformed into the rolling hills and ancient woodlands that had characterized this corner of England since time immemorial. The fields were bare, awaiting spring's renewal, and the trees stood skeletal against the pale sky, their branches intricate as lace. Occasionally, they passed through small villages where church spires rose like fingers pointing toward heaven. And Watson found himself wondering how many of those bells were ringing out Christmas carols at this very moment, joyful and bright, so unlike the mysterious tolling that awaited them in Ravenswood. Reverend Blackwood spoke during the journey, filling in details about his parish and its people, painting a picture of rural English life that was at once timeless and slowly changing as modernity crept even into the most isolated corners of the countryside. He spoke of farmers and their families, of the local squire, Lord Pemberton, who resided at Ravenswood Manor, of the village schoolmistress and the innkeeper, the blacksmith and the doctor, all the characters that comprised a small community's tapestry. The church is truly the heart of our village, he said, as the train rattled onward, the rhythm of wheels on track providing a soothing percussion beneath his words. It is where we celebrate and mourn, where generations have come to mark the passages of life. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, these ceremonies connect us not only to God, but to each other, to our ancestors, to the land itself. The thought that something has invaded that sacred space turned it into a source of fear rather than comfort. It grieves me beyond measure. Holmes, who had been watching the passing landscape with apparent casualness, but was undoubtedly observing details Watson could not perceive, turned his attention fully to their companion. "Tell me about the church's history," he requested. "Not merely the broad strokes, but the particulars, when it was built, what modifications it has undergone, any local legends or traditions associated with it." Blackwood settled more comfortably into his seat, clearly on familiar ground. St. Dunstan's dates to the late 11th century, shortly after the conquest, though there is evidence of an earlier Saxon church on the same site. Carved stones incorporated into the current structure, fragments of crosses, certain foundations that predate the Norman construction. St. Dunstan himself was a 10th century English saint, Archbishop of Canterbury, known for his learning and, interestingly, for his association with metalworking and bells. Legend says he once grabbed the devil by the nose with his blacksmith's tongs, driving the evil one away. He smiled slightly at this. So, perhaps the choice of dedication was meant to provide protection against dark forces. The church was built by the first Norman lord of Ravenswood, one Geoffrey de Courcy, who held the land by grant from William himself. It was a substantial structure for a small village, suggesting that Geoffrey had ambitions for the place that were never quite realized. The bell tower was added in the 13th century, during the reign of Henry III, and the bells themselves date from various periods, the oldest from 1520, the newest cast in 1680 after the Restoration. Watson found himself drawn into the history, imagining the centuries of worship, the countless souls who had passed through that church's doors. And the legend Mrs. Thornbury mentioned about the church being built on pagan ground. Ah, yes, Blackwood acknowledged. That is a persistent tradition, though I have never found documentary evidence to support it. However, it is true that many early Christian churches were deliberately built on sites sacred to the old religions, a way of reclaiming the landscape for the new faith, or perhaps recognizing that certain places have always been thin, where the boundary between the physical world and the spiritual is more permeable than elsewhere. The area around Ravenswood has numerous ancient sites, barrows, standing stones, the remnants of a Roman villa. It is old country, Mr. Holmes, where memory runs deep. The train began to slow, and through the window, Watson could see they were approaching a small station. The sign that passed by read Ravenswood in faded letters, and as they came to a halt with a great hiss of steam and screech of brakes, he felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with something less definable. A slight unease, perhaps, or merely the sense of stepping into a story whose conclusion remained unwritten. The platform was empty, save for a single station attendant who touched his cap to them as they disembarked. The air here was noticeably colder than in London, carrying the sharp clarity of rural winter, scented with wood smoke from village fires and the earthiness of recently turned fields. In the near distance, perhaps a quarter-mile away, Watson could see the village itself, a cluster of stone and timber buildings arranged along a single main street, and rising above them all, the square tower of St. Dunstan's Church, solid and grey against the afternoon sky. The vicarage is adjacent to the church, Blackwood explained, as he led them toward a waiting cart. Not a proper carriage, but a farm conveyance that would serve to transport them and their modest luggage. I thought we might stop there briefly to leave your bags, and then, if you wish, I could show you the church itself before darkness falls. The days are short now, and I would have you see it by natural light first. Holmes agreed readily, and they climbed aboard the cart, which was driven by a young man Blackwood introduced as Tom Winters, the blacksmith's apprentice. The youth nodded shyly, but said nothing, his eyes darting between the newcomers with obvious curiosity. Strangers were evidently rare in Ravenswood, especially on Christmas Day. The ride was brief, but informative. Watson observed the village as they passed through it. Neat cottages with thatched or slate roofs, small gardens dormant now, but doubtless productive in season. The occasional face peering from a window at the sound of their passage. There was an inn called the Green Man, its sign depicting a foliate face peering from surrounding leaves, a reminder of the old traditions Blackwood had mentioned. The village shop stood closed for the holiday, as did the smithy, though smoke rose from the chimney of the house attached to it. And then they were at the church, and Watson felt his breath catch slightly. St. Dunstan's was indeed ancient, its stone weathered by centuries of wind and rain to a pale grey gold that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. The architecture was primarily Norman. The rounded arch of the doorway, the small, deeply set windows, the massive solidity of the walls spoke of an age when buildings were meant to endure through anything. The tower rose 4 stories, plain and strong, its bell openings dark and empty seeming from this angle. The surrounding churchyard was studded with headstones and monuments dating back centuries, some leaning drunkenly, others still standing straight and proud, testimony to lives lived and finished in this small corner of England. The vicarage beside the church was a more modest structure, Georgian in period, built of red brick with white-painted windows. Blackwood led them inside, and they found themselves in a comfortable, if somewhat shabby home that spoke of its occupants' priorities. The books were plentiful and well cared for, the furniture serviceable but worn, the atmosphere one of scholarly preoccupation rather than domestic comfort. They deposited their bags in the guest rooms he indicated, simple spaces with narrow beds, plain wardrobes, and washstands with chipped porcelain bowls, but clean and adequate. "Now," Holmes said, returning downstairs where Blackwood waited. "The church, if you please. I wish to examine it thoroughly before the sun sets, and I have many questions." Blackwood led them back outside and across the short distance to the church. He produced a large iron key from his pocket, and Watson heard the heavy clunk of the lock disengaging, a sound that seemed to echo in the still afternoon air. The door swung open with a creak that spoke of age and infrequent oiling, and they stepped into the cool dimness within. The interior of St. Dunstan's was exactly what Watson expected, and yet somehow more. The atmosphere of centuries of worship seemed to hang in the air like incense, though no incense had been burned this day. The nave stretched before them, flanked by Norman pillars supporting rounded arches, leading to a chancel where the altar stood dressed in Christmas white and gold. The floor was paved with stones, worn smooth by countless feet, and scattered throughout were memorial brasses and engraved slabs marking the resting places of notable parishioners from ages past. The windows, though small, were filled with stained glass that cast jeweled light across the stone when the sun caught them at the proper angle, though in the current flat afternoon light they appeared merely dark and intricate. Holmes moved through the space with intense focus, his eyes darting everywhere, taking in details, making mental notes. He examined the font, the pulpit, the rood screen that separated nave from chancel. He walked the perimeter, studying the walls, the floors, occasionally kneeling to examine something more closely. Watson, accustomed to these methodical investigations, waited patiently, as did Blackwood, though the Reverend's face showed puzzlement at what the detective might hope to discover in these familiar surroundings. "The bell tower," Holmes said eventually. "How does one access it?" Blackwood led them to the base of the tower, where a small door set into the wall opened onto a narrow spiral staircase, the steps worn concave by centuries of use. "The ringing chamber is one level up," he explained. "The stairs continue to the bell chamber itself, above that, though, as I mentioned, that door has been locked for years." They ascended, Watson noting how the stone walls seemed to close in around them, how the light diminished with each turning of the spiral. The ringing chamber, when they reached it, was a small, square room with the 6 bell ropes hanging through holes in the ceiling, their coloured sallies, the woolly grips used by ringers, bright against the grey stone surroundings. There were simple wooden benches along the walls where ringers could rest between their efforts. Holmes examined each rope carefully, running his hands along them, checking the ends where they disappeared into the ceiling. "These show no sign of recent use," he observed. "No unusual wear, no disturbance of the dust on the wooden guides." He looked up at the ceiling, and above. "The bell chamber," Blackwood said. "The stairs continue up." He led them to a second, narrower staircase that ended in a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. The door had a large, old-fashioned lock, and Blackwood produced another key. Though this one showed clear signs of disuse, its bit slightly rusted. "I had to oil this lock yesterday to get it open," he admitted as he worked the key. It hadn't been turned in years. The lock finally surrendered with a reluctant clunk, and he pushed the door open. The bell chamber was a space of deep shadows and architectural honesty. Here, the stone walls showed their true thickness, and the great wooden frame that held the bells dominated the room. The 6 bells hung in their positions, each mounted on a massive wooden wheel. The whole arrangement a testament to centuries of engineering tradition. Ropes ran from the wheels down through the floor to the ringing chamber below. The 4 walls had openings, the louvered bell windows through which sound would carry across the countryside. And through these openings, the afternoon light entered in dusty shafts. Holmes moved among the bells like a pilgrim among relics, examining each one with minute attention. He ran his hands over the metal, peered at the crown staples from which they hung, studied the wheels and the bearings. He examined the ropes at their upper ends, the floor, the walls. He produced a small lens from his pocket and used it to scrutinize details invisible to the naked eye. Watson and Blackwood watched in silence, understanding that Holmes was doing what he did best, observing, cataloguing, building a framework of facts upon which conclusions could eventually be supported. The bells themselves were beautiful in their way, massive and solid, their bronze surfaces bearing the marks of their casting, and, in some cases, inscriptions in Latin that spoke of their dedication and purpose. The largest, the tenor, bore the date 1520 and a prayer for the dead. The smallest carried the initials of the foundryman, who had cast it in 1680. "As you said, Reverend," Holmes finally spoke, his voice carrying oddly in the acoustic space of the bell chamber. "Everything here appears exactly as it should. The dust is undisturbed, save where we have walked. The spider webs are intact. There is no mechanism I can detect that might cause these bells to ring without the ropes being pulled from below. And yet..." He paused, standing very still, his head tilted as if listening to something beyond the range of normal hearing. "And yet," Blackwood prompted softly. "And yet there is something here," Holmes said slowly. "Not a mechanism, not anything physical that I can currently identify, but the space feels inhabited, for want of a better term. Watson, do you sense it?" Watson paused, trying to set aside his rational medical training and simply feel. And yes, there was something, a quality to the air perhaps, or the way sound seemed to linger slightly too long, or the subtle sense of being observed that Blackwood had mentioned. Nothing he could quantify or measure, but nonetheless present, like the change in atmosphere before a thunderstorm. "I think I do," he admitted, "though I cannot explain it." Holmes nodded, as if this confirmed something. "We will return to the vicarage for now. I wish to review any documents you have regarding the church's history, Reverend, particularly anything pertaining to Reverend Grail and his tenure. We will also need to speak with Mrs. Thornbury about her memories. But first, we will wait for nightfall and for 3 o'clock in the morning, when we will be here to experience these phantom bells ourselves." They descended from the tower, the spiral stairs seeming even narrower on the way down, as if the church itself was reluctant to release them. As they emerged into the nave, the afternoon light had already begun to fade, the short winter day racing toward its conclusion. Blackwood locked the door carefully behind them, and they returned to the vicarage as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Sussex. The evening passed in quiet research and conversation. Blackwood had accumulated a substantial amount of documentation regarding St. Dunstan's over his 32 years of ministry, and he brought out ledgers, parish registers, old correspondence, and historical notes for Holmes's perusal. They dined simply on cold meat and bread. The Reverend was a bachelor with only a woman from the village who came in daily to cook and clean, and she was with her own family for Christmas. Watson found he didn't mind the simple fare. There was something appropriate about it, given the circumstances and the season's true meaning, far removed from elaborate feasting. Holmes pored over the documents with his characteristic intensity, occasionally making notes in his pocketbook, or asking Blackwood for clarification on some point. Watson, for his part, examined the more recent parish registers, noting the names of families that had been in Ravenswood for generations. Winters, Thornbury, Ashford. Blackwood himself was descended from local stock, a son of the village who had gone away to university and returned to serve his community. The entry regarding Reverend Grayle's tenure was indeed frustratingly brief. He had been instituted as vicar in June of 1793, had served without remarkable incident for 7 years, and then there was simply a notation in January 1801. Rev. E. Grayle departed the parish under circumstances unclear. Rev. William Makepeace instituted March 1801. No elaboration, no explanation, no hint of the mystery that Blackwood and Mrs. Thornbury had suggested. It's as if they deliberately obscured the details, Watson observed. One would expect some account of his resignation, or his death if he died, or his transfer to another parish. This tells us nothing. Which is itself telling, Holmes replied, looking up from a brittle piece of correspondence he had been examining. When records are deliberately sparse, it suggests something unpleasant or inexplicable, that those responsible for the records preferred not to discuss. Scandal, perhaps, or something that defied their ability to categorize and record. Reverend, have you found any personal papers of Grayle's? Letters, journals, sermons? Blackwood shook his head regretfully. Nothing. When a new vicar takes possession of the living, personal effects of the previous occupant are typically removed by family or sent to his new post if he is transferred. In Grayle's case, there is simply nothing. It's as if he arrived with nothing and left with nothing, though that seems unlikely for a man of education and holy orders. Holmes set down the document he had been reading. I would very much like to speak with Mrs. Thornbury tomorrow. Tonight, however, we keep vigil. Reverend, I suggest you try to rest for a few hours. Watson and I will remain wakeful. We are accustomed to irregular hours, and when the time approaches, we will wake you and proceed to the church. I want us positioned inside before 3 o'clock to observe the phenomenon from its inception if possible. Blackwood agreed, though Watson could see the fear still present in his eyes. The prospect of experiencing those phantom bells again, even with companions present, clearly unsettled him deeply. The Reverend retired to his own room, leaving Holmes and Watson in the small study where they had been working. The house settled into nighttime quiet. Outside, the village was utterly silent. No sounds of celebration, no late-night revelers, just the occasional hoot of an owl and the whisper of wind through bare branches. Holmes had moved to the window and stood looking out toward the church, visible as a darker mass against the star-studded sky. What do you really think, Holmes? Watson asked quietly. Is this some elaborate hoax, or is there something genuinely inexplicable occurring? Holmes was silent for a long moment. "I think," he finally said, "that we are dealing with something that operates on the boundary between the physical and the psychological, between the explicable and the mysterious. Those bells are ringing, of that I am certain, as too many reliable witnesses have heard them. The mechanism by which they ring, however, eludes conventional explanation. But Watson, my friend, remember that impossible and unexplained are not synonyms. We simply have not yet accumulated sufficient data to formulate a comprehensive theory. Tonight will provide more data, and from that, understanding will come." They passed the remaining hours in quiet conversation and contemplation. Holmes smoked his pipe, the familiar ritual providing a constant rhythm to the passing time. Watson dozed lightly in his chair, not truly sleeping, but resting, his body's conditioning from his years in Afghanistan and his subsequent adventures with Holmes, allowing him to snatch rest wherever possible, while remaining alert to any change in circumstances. At 2:30, Holmes gently shook Watson fully awake. "Time," he said simply. They climbed the stairs and knocked softly on Blackwood's door. The Reverend emerged almost immediately. Clearly, he had not slept, or, if he had, very fitfully. They dressed warmly against the winter night, donned heavy coats and took lanterns, and stepped out into the December darkness. The cold was sharp and immediate, the kind of penetrating chill that seeks out any gap in one's defenses. The sky above was brilliant with stars. No moon tonight, or at least not yet risen, leaving the heavens to display their full glory. Watson could see the Milky Way stretched across the vault of the sky like a river of light, and for a moment he was struck by the vastness of creation, by how small their concerns must seem against such immensity, and yet how those concerns filled their immediate reality completely. The church loomed before them, darker than the surrounding darkness, its stone seeming to absorb what little light existed. Blackwood unlocked the door. The sound of the key in the lock seemed startlingly loud in the night, and they entered the space that by day had seemed solemn but peaceful, and now felt charged with waiting, with anticipation of something about to unfold. They left their lanterns burning low and positioned themselves in the nave, Holmes choosing a spot approximately halfway between the door and the altar, where he could observe in multiple directions. Watson stood nearby, while Blackwood remained close to the door, as if keeping a line of retreat open. The Reverend's face in the lantern light was pale and strained. They waited. The church was not silent. Old buildings never are. There were the small sounds of stone adjusting to temperature changes, the faint scurrying of mice in the walls, the creak of ancient timbers. But beneath and beyond these ordinary sounds, there was something else, a quality of listening, as if the church itself was waiting alongside them. Watson checked his pocket watch. 10 minutes to 3. 5 minutes. 3. Then, precisely as the watch's hands aligned at 3 o'clock, it began. The sound started so softly that for a moment Watson thought he might be imagining it, a vibration more felt than heard, travelling through the stone floors and into his bones. Then it grew, rapidly becoming unmistakable, the sound of bells ringing in the tower above them. But these were not the joyful peals of celebration, nor the solemn tolls of mourning. These bells sang with a voice that was at once beautiful and deeply melancholy, a sound that seemed to carry within it layers of meaning and emotion that words could never capture. All 6 bells were sounding, as Blackwood had described, but not in any pattern Watson recognized. They overlapped and interwove in a complex mathematical music that was both alien and strangely compelling. Watson looked at Holmes and saw the detective standing absolutely still, his face rapt with concentration, his entire being focused on the phenomenon unfolding above them. Blackwood had sunk to his knees. Whether in prayer or fear, Watson could not tell. The sound filled the church, resonating in the stone, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. And with the sound came something else, a presence, undeniable now, a sense of other minds or spirits, or whatever name one wished to give them, as if the ringing of the bells had opened a door between worlds, and through that door attention was focused upon the 3 living men in the nave below. The bells continued their impossible music, and Watson found himself deeply moved by it, despite his fear. There was grief in those tones, yes, but also longing and hope and a strange kind of joy, as if whatever guided them was expressing something too complex for any single emotion. He felt tears on his cheeks without quite knowing why he was crying. Holmes had moved to the base of the tower and was looking up, though of course nothing could be seen. The door to the ringing chamber remained closed, and beyond it the bells rang on. The sound continued for what felt like both a moment and an eternity. Watson later checked his watch and discovered it had been nearly 25 minutes, longer than any previous occurrence according to Blackwood's account. Then, gradually, it began to fade, each bell falling silent in turn, until only the smallest remained, its bright voice calling out alone in the darkness, pure and clear as a child's laughter. Finally, it too ceased, and silence rushed back in, like water filling a void. For a long moment, none of them moved or spoke. Then, Blackwood rose shakily to his feet, and Holmes returned from the tower base, his expression one of intense thought. "Remarkable," the detective said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if reluctant to break the spell. "Truly remarkable. Watson, did you observe—" "I heard it, yes," Watson replied, finding his own voice rough with emotion. "Holmes, I have never experienced anything quite like that. It was as if the bells were trying to communicate something, to tell a story, or express a truth that transcends language." "My assessment exactly," Holmes agreed. He turned to Blackwood. "Reverend, you have my apologies. When you first described this phenomenon, I confess I suspected exaggeration or nervous imagination might have colored your account. I was wrong. What we have just experienced is genuine, profound, and utterly unprecedented in my experience. Tomorrow we must speak with Mrs. Thornbury and anyone else who might have knowledge of the church's history. There is a message here, or a plea, or a warning, something that demands to be understood, and we have, if the pattern holds, 8 days in which to understand it." They exited the church and returned to the vicarage, none of them speaking much, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. The sky in the east was just beginning to show the first faint lightning that presaged dawn. They had been in the church longer than Watson had realized, the experience seeming to exist outside normal time. Back in the vicarage, they gathered in the study once more, and Blackwood prepared tea with shaking hands, the familiar ritual helping to ground them back in the ordinary world. Holmes had taken out his notebook and was writing rapidly, recording his observations while they remained fresh. The duration was approximately 23 minutes, he said, checking Watson's watch against his own notes. an increase of approximately 3 minutes from the previous night, if Blackwood's measurements are accurate. The pattern suggests that if this continues, the final night, the 29th night, will see the bells ring for perhaps 45 minutes or more. A full quarter hour at least, possibly approaching an hour. "But what does it mean?" Blackwood asked, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "What are they trying to communicate?" For I agree with Dr. Watson. There was intention in that ringing, a desire to convey something. But what? And to whom? Holmes set down his pen. Those are precisely the questions we must answer. Tomorrow, or rather, later today, we begin our investigation in earnest. We will interview Mrs. Thornbury. We will examine the church again by daylight. And we will delve as deeply as possible into the history of Reverend Grail and his disappearance. Somewhere in the past lies the key to the present mystery. They talked a while longer, going over details, sharing impressions. But eventually exhaustion claimed them. Watson retired to his narrow guest bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The kind that comes after profound emotional or spiritual experiences, when the mind simply needs to retreat and process. He woke to find weak winter sunlight filtering through the window and the smell of bacon cooking somewhere below. Rising and dressing, he descended to find Holmes already awake and Blackwood in the kitchen preparing a proper breakfast. The daily woman had arrived earlier and left provisions, but respected the Reverend's preference to cook for his guests himself. They ate heartily, the experiences of the night seeming both vivid and dreamlike now in the morning light. After breakfast, Blackwood led them on a short walk through the village to Mrs. Thornbury's cottage, a small but well-maintained dwelling near the far end of the main street. The woman who answered their knock was indeed very elderly, her face a landscape of wrinkles, her hair pure white, but her eyes were bright and sharp, and her posture, though bent, carried a certain dignity. She invited them in without hesitation when Blackwood explained their purpose, settling them in her tiny sitting room where a cheerful fire burned and a large ginger cat occupied the place of honour on the hearthrug. "You've come about the bells," she said, without preamble, her voice wavery but clear. "I wondered if anyone would. The Reverend here has asked me about them, but I think he thought I was perhaps wandering in my wits, bringing up things from so long ago." She fixed Holmes with a penetrating stare. "You're the London detective he went to fetch, Sherlock Holmes. I may be old, but I still read the papers when my grandson brings them. You solve impossible things." "I attempt to," Holmes replied with a slight smile. "Mrs. Thornbury, Reverend Blackwood tells me you remember when the bells rang before, when you were a young woman. I would be very grateful if you could tell me everything you recall about that time, no matter how small or insignificant the detail might seem." The old woman settled back in her chair, her eyes growing distant as she reached back across the decades. "It was the winter of 1800 going into 1801, she began, her voice taking on the rhythm of one telling a story long held in memory. "I was 22 years old, newly married to Thomas Thornbury. He's been gone these 40 years, God rest him. We lived in a cottage not far from here, and I remember that winter was particularly hard, snow and frost for weeks on end. Reverend Grail had been our vicar for 7 years at that point. He was a strange man, not unkind, but not warm either, scholarly, always with his books and his studies. He was particularly interested in the church itself. He would spend hours in there when it wasn't service time, measuring and examining and writing things down in his journals. Some folk thought him odd, but he performed his duties well enough, and we left him to his peculiarities. Then, just after Christmas, I think it was the 27th or 28th of December, the bells began to ring at night. 3 o'clock in the morning, just like now. It frightened us all terribly. The Reverend insisted there was some natural explanation, but he couldn't find one. Night after night they rang, getting longer each time, just as you've been experiencing. She paused, reaching down to stroke the cat, which had moved to lean against her legs. On the 12th night, Reverend Grail called a meeting in the church. He had discovered something, he said, something important about the church's history. He seemed excited, but also frightened. I remember that clearly. He said he would reveal everything the next morning, after one final night of investigation. He asked several of the men to meet him at the church at 2:30 the next morning, before the bells began, to witness something. My Thomas was among those asked. But when the men arrived at the appointed time, the church was locked, and Reverend Grail was nowhere to be found. They waited, and at 3 o'clock the bells began to ring as usual. But that night, the ringing was different, fuller somehow, more joyful, though still melancholy beneath. It went on for nearly an hour, and when it finally stopped, and the men managed to get the church open, they had to fetch the churchwarden, who had a second key. They found the church empty, completely empty. Grail was gone, and he was never seen again. What happened then? Watson asked, leaning forward intently. Well, there was a great commotion, naturally, Mrs. Thornbury continued. The magistrate was called. There was an investigation, but no trace of the Reverend was ever found. His rooms in the vicarage were undisturbed, his possessions all in place, but the man himself had vanished, as if he'd never existed. The bishop sent a new vicar within 2 months, a very practical man who wanted no talk of mysteries or phantoms. He had the bell chamber door locked and sealed, and gave orders that it was not to be opened except for necessary repairs. And the bells fell silent. No more midnight ringings. Eventually, people stopped talking about it, though the story was handed down. Most folk now think it was just a legend, something that got exaggerated in the telling. Holmes had been listening with absolute attention. These journals you mentioned, Grail's writings about the church, do you know what became of them? Mrs. Thornbury shook her head. I don't, sir. I suppose they might have been taken away with his other possessions, or perhaps the new vicar disposed of them. That was near a century ago. Most things from that time are long gone or forgotten. Did Grail have any particular associates in the village? Anyone he might have confided in? He kept mostly to himself, she replied, though I do remember he spent considerable time with old Lord Pemberton, not the current lord, but his great-grandfather. They were both scholars of a sort, interested in antiquities and history. But Lord Pemberton died not long after Grail disappeared. Some said of shock and grief, though he was quite elderly anyway. Holmes rose and bowed slightly to the old woman. Mrs. Thornbury, you have been immensely helpful. Thank you for your clear memory and your willingness to share it. One final question. When the bells rang that last night, the night Grail disappeared, did you hear them yourself? They thanked her again and took their leave, stepping back out into the cold morning. As they walked back toward the church, Holmes was silent, clearly processing what they had learned. The pattern repeats, he finally said. 12 nights of ringing, culminating in a disappearance on the 13th. We are now on the 22nd night, if we count from when the current phenomenon began. That gives us 7 more nights before what? Before Blackwood disappears, as Grail did? Before something else occurs? The question is, what did Grail discover? What was he investigating that led to his vanishing? Could there be documents hidden somewhere in the church? Watson suggested. Some record he left behind that might explain his findings. Possible, Holmes agreed. We should conduct a thorough search, but I suspect that whatever Grail discovered, it was not merely documentary. It was something about the physical structure of the church itself. Something about the bells or the tower, or perhaps something concealed within the building's fabric. They spent the remainder of the day in exactly that fashion, conducting a meticulous examination of St. Dunstan's church. Holmes measured and tapped and peered into every corner, examining the stonework for hidden cavities, the floor for concealed spaces, the walls for irregularities. Watson assisted as best he could, while Blackwood hovered anxiously, torn between hope that they would discover something and fear of what that discovery might be. As afternoon waned toward evening, Holmes made an interesting find. In the chancel, behind the altar, the stone flooring showed signs of having been disturbed at some point. The mortar between certain stones was subtly different in colour and composition from the surrounding area, suggesting repair or replacement. "Reverend," Holmes called out, "has there been any work done in this area? Any repairs or restoration you're aware of?" Blackwood came to examine the spot Holmes indicated. "Not during my tenure," he said, kneeling for a closer look, "though I see what you mean. These stones do look different. Perhaps during a previous vicar's time. The church records might indicate any major repairs." They returned to the vicarage as darkness gathered, and Blackwood produced a series of ledgers documenting expenditures and repairs over the decades. Holmes pored over these, while Watson prepared tea, a role he was falling into naturally, as these domestic rituals provided welcome structure and normalcy amidst the mystery. "Here," Holmes said suddenly, his finger marking a place in a ledger dated 1827. "Repairs to the chancel floor following subsidence. 3 stones replaced, and the area beneath reinforced. And look, a note in the margin, apparently added later, in different ink. Discovered sealed chamber, contents removed to vestry." Blackwood looked at the entry with surprise. "I've never seen that notation before. I've reviewed these ledgers countless times over the years. Or, if I did see it, it didn't register as significant. A sealed chamber beneath the chancel floor. And contents removed to the vestry," Holmes repeated. "Reverend, does the church have any storage areas, any collection of old materials that might include items from such a discovery? The vestry has cabinets with old communion vessels, some ancient parish records, broken pieces from damaged monuments." Blackwood's eyes widened. "I've never thoroughly examined everything there. Some of it has been accumulating for centuries. Could something from this hidden chamber still be among those items?" There was no question of waiting. Despite the late hour and the approaching time when the bells would ring again, they lit lanterns and returned to the church. The vestry was a small room accessible from the chancel, lined with cabinets and shelves. They began a systematic search, examining everything, pulling out items that hadn't seen light in years. Dust billowed as they worked, cobwebs draped across their hands, but they persisted. Watson found a collection of medieval floor tiles, beautiful despite their broken state. Blackwood uncovered a series of parish registers so old that the ink had faded to brown ghosts on crumbling pages. And then Holmes, searching through a bottom cabinet that appeared to contain only moth-eaten altar cloths, discovered something solid wrapped within the fabric. He lifted it out carefully, a metal box, perhaps a foot square and half that in depth, dark with tarnish, but solidly constructed with a simple latch. The box was not locked, and Holmes opened it to reveal its contents. Several journals bound in cracked leather, their pages covered in close, careful handwriting, a collection of loose papers, and several objects wrapped in cloth. Grayle's journals, Holmes breathed, his excitement barely contained. This must be what was found when they opened the sealed chamber. The question is, why were these hidden, and why has no one examined them in all these years? Blackwood reached toward the journals, then hesitated. Should we? Is it safe? Safe? Holmes looked at him quizzically. These items were sealed away for a reason, Blackwood said, his voice uncertain. Whatever Grayle discovered, it led to his disappearance. Perhaps there are things not meant to be known. Holmes's expression softened slightly. I understand your concern, Reverend, but we have passed the point of being able to turn back from this mystery. The bells are ringing, counting down towards something, and we must understand what if we are to prevent history from repeating itself. Whatever knowledge these journals contain, we need it. They carefully transported the box back to the vicarage, Holmes carrying it as if it were made of spun glass. Once in the warmth and light of the study, they laid out the contents on the desk. The journals numbered 4, each covering what appeared to be a different period or aspect of Grayle's research. The loose papers were notes, sketches, and what looked like copies of older documents, some in Latin, some in English, so archaic that it was nearly a foreign tongue. The wrapped objects, when carefully uncovered, proved to be peculiar. A small stone carving, depicting a figure with antlers, clearly very ancient. A fragment of what might be Roman mosaic, and a piece of worked metal that resembled nothing so much as a bell clapper, though sized for a much smaller bell than those in the tower. Holmes carefully opened the first journal to its opening page. The date inscribed there was June 15th, 1793, shortly after Grayle had taken up his position at St. Dunstan's. He began to read aloud, I have arrived in Ravenswood and taken possession of the living. The vicarage is comfortable, the church ancient and fascinating. I confess that I accepted this post not merely for the spiritual duties, though I shall perform those faithfully, but because St. Dunstan's has long intrigued me. During my studies at Cambridge, I encountered references to this church in several obscure manuscripts, references that suggested it is not merely a typical country parish church, but something more, a place of deep antiquity and considerable mystery. I intend to research its history thoroughly while fulfilling my pastoral obligations. Holmes looked up at his companions. He came here deliberately, seeking something. Let us see what he found. He turned pages, skimming through entries that detailed Grayle's early explorations of the church, his measurements and observations, his conversations with older parishioners about local legends and traditions. Then, several months into the first journal, the tone shifted. Holmes read, I have made a remarkable discovery. While examining the chancel floor, certain stones have an unusual acoustic property when walked upon. I have detected what can only be a void beneath the surface. The sound is hollow, suggesting a chamber of some size. Local tradition speaks of a crypt, but the sexton assures me the church has no crypt, and I can find no evidence of any entrance. Could there be a hidden space, sealed during some past century? And if so, what might it contain? I have written to Lord Pemberton, who has expressed great interest and offered to assist in an investigation. So, he found the chamber beneath the chancel, Watson observed, and had not yet opened it. Holmes continued through the journal, finding entries that detailed Grayle's research into the church's history, his discovery of references to a sacred well that supposedly existed on the site before the Christian church was built, and his growing conviction that St. Dunstan's stood upon a location of great antiquity and spiritual significance. The second journal began several months later and dealt primarily with Grayle's scholarly research into pre-Christian religion in Britain, into the practices of the Saxons and Romans, and even earlier peoples. There were detailed notes about bell lore, the use of bells in various traditions to mark time, to ward off evil, to summon spirits, to mark boundaries between worlds. The third journal opened with an entry dated April 1800. Lord Pemberton and I have, with the blessing of the bishop, undertaken to examine the void beneath the chancel floor. We selected a time when the church was unlikely to be needed, and worked in utmost privacy. The stones were lifted with great care, revealing a set of steps descending into darkness. With lanterns and considerable trepidation, we descended. What we found can only be described as a chamber of the old religion, not Christian, not Roman, but something far older. The space is perhaps 12 feet square, the walls natural rock, but carved with symbols that I recognize from my studies as belonging to the tradition of the ancient Britons. In the center stood a stone basin or font, and around the walls were carved niches containing objects. The antler-crowned figure I have preserved, fragments of pottery, worked stones, and several small bells, ancient beyond measure, green with verdigris. But most remarkable of all was the manuscript, if it can be called such. A series of metal plates inscribed with symbols in a script I have never encountered, though it bears some resemblance to Ogham and to certain Roman cursive forms. Lord Pemberton believes it may be a form of indigenous British writing, created by the Druids or their predecessors. If we could decipher this text, we might gain insight into the beliefs and practices of those who held this place sacred long before Christianity came to these shores. Holmes paused in his reading, his eyes gleaming with intellectual excitement. They found a pre-Christian shrine beneath the church, not uncommon in itself, as churches were often built on existing sacred sites. But this manuscript... He turned to the fourth journal, which was slimmer than the others, and found that it consisted entirely of Grayle's attempts to translate the mysterious text. Page after page showed the symbols copied out, with tentative translations and notes, cross-references to other ancient texts, speculation and revision. The final entries in the journal, dated December of 1800, showed that Grayle believed he had achieved at least a partial translation. Holmes read these aloud with intense focus. I have broken the code, or believe I have. The symbols are indeed a form of writing, and the text they preserve is a kind of ritual instruction, a framework for communion, for lack of a better word. The ancient people who held this place sacred believed that certain locations were thin places where the boundary between the world we inhabit and other realms of existence became permeable. They believed that through proper ritual, through specific sounds, rhythms, and intentions, it was possible to achieve communication with those who had passed beyond, with spirits or ancestors, or whatever name one wishes to give, to conscious entities not bound by physical form. The bells were central to this practice. Not the church bells that now hang in the tower, of course, but their ancient predecessors, bells cast with specific mathematical proportions, rung in specific patterns, creating vibrations that somehow facilitated this communion. The text describes how these bells, when properly rung, could create what it calls a bridge of sound, allowing passage or communication between worlds. More disturbing is what the text says about the responsibility of the bell ringer, the one who creates this bridge. It speaks of sacrifice, of offering, though I confess the exact nature of this is unclear from the translation. Does it mean symbolic sacrifice, or something more literal? And most puzzling of all, there is a recurring phrase I translate as the completion of the circle, or perhaps the closing of the pattern. What circle? What pattern? The text ends with what appears to be a warning, or perhaps a promise, that the bells will ring when the bridge must be built, that the keeper will know the call, and that what was sundered must be rejoined. I confess this troubles me greatly, for it suggests that the process described is not merely historical, but potentially ongoing, that whatever ritual or tradition this text describes might somehow still be active, still exerting influence across the centuries. The journal ended there, mid-thought, as if Grail had intended to write more, but had been interrupted or had run out of time. There was one final loose paper tucked into the back cover, a note in Grail's handwriting, but written in evident haste, the letters shaky and urgent. 23rd of December, 1800. The bells have been ringing for 12 nights. I understand now. They are ringing for me. I am being called to complete what was begun centuries ago, to finish the bridge that those ancient practitioners started but could not complete. Lord Pemberton is dead, passed in his sleep last night, the doctor says, but I believe the truth is otherwise. He was not strong enough, not the one meant to answer the call, but I feel the pull so strongly. It is not evil, I am certain of that, but it is powerful and demanding and inexorable. Tomorrow night will be the 13th. I have asked the men to meet me at the church to witness what I believe will occur. If my understanding is correct, the completion of the pattern requires a willing participant, one who understands and accepts the role. I believe I am meant to serve as that participant, to step across the bridge the bells are building and bring knowledge back, or perhaps to complete some ancient purpose that has waited all this time for fulfillment. I am afraid, but I am also filled with awe and curiosity. If I do not return, let it be known that I went willingly, in service of understanding, in pursuit of truth that transcends the boundaries we take for granted. The bells are calling, and I will answer. Silence filled the study as Holmes finished reading. The fire had burned low, and the room was full of shadows. Outside, the night was deep and cold, and somewhere in that darkness, an ancient church waited for 3 o'clock to arrive. Blackwood's face was pale. He went willingly, he whispered. He understood what was happening, and chose to... what? To disappear, to sacrifice himself, to cross over into some other realm. Holmes carefully closed the journal and sat back in his chair. Grail believed he had uncovered evidence of an ancient tradition, a practice by which those who held this place sacred used bells and perhaps other elements to create a state conducive to communication with non-physical entities. Whether such communication is truly possible, or whether Grail simply drove himself into a state of altered consciousness or even madness, we cannot say with certainty. But we can say this: he experienced something real enough that he willingly walked into it, and he vanished so completely that no trace of him was ever found. And now it's happening again, Watson said. The bells are ringing the same way, building toward a 29th night, a culmination, and Blackwood is the current vicar, the keeper of this place. The pattern is repeating. But we have one advantage Grail did not, Holmes said firmly. We have his journals, his research, his warning. We know what he believed was happening, and we have the opportunity to approach this with eyes open, to study and understand, rather than simply being swept along by events. Blackwood rose abruptly and moved to the window, staring out toward the church. What am I to do, Mr. Holmes, if this force, this calling, is focused on me as the vicar of St. Dunstan's? How do I resist it? Or should I resist it? Grail seemed to think that answering the call was the right course, that it served some higher purpose. We don't yet have enough information to make that judgment, Holmes replied. But we have 7 more nights before the 29th. In that time, we will investigate every aspect of this mystery. We will examine those metal plates if they still exist in the hidden chamber. We will study the church's architecture and the bell's construction with Grail's research in mind, and we will observe each night's ringing carefully to detect any changes or patterns. A clock somewhere in the house chimed, 2:15 in the morning. They had been so absorbed in reading the journals that time had slipped past unnoticed, and the hour of the bell's ringing was approaching rapidly. We should return to the church, Holmes said, rising. Tonight we will listen with new understanding, knowing something of what those bells might represent. And we will watch Reverend Blackwood carefully, to see if he experiences this compulsion Grail described. They bundled back into their coats and made their way through the silent village to St. Dunstan's. The stars above were magnificent, and a thought struck Watson. How many people across how many centuries had stood in this same place, looked up at these same stars, and pondered the mysteries of existence? The church before them was merely the latest in a series of sacred structures. But the human questions, the yearning to understand and connect with something beyond the physical world, those were timeless. Inside the church, they took up positions similar to the previous night. Holmes stood alert and observant. Watson sat in a pew with his notebook, ready to record his impressions. And Blackwood knelt in prayer near the altar, though Watson suspected the Reverend was praying as much for strength and clarity as for divine protection. 3 o'clock arrived, and with it the bells. Tonight their voice seemed clearer, more insistent, and Watson could hear what he hadn't quite perceived before. Beneath the surface melody, there was a deeper pattern, a mathematical precision to the ringing that suggested not randomness, but carefully structured intention. He watched Blackwood and saw the Reverend's head lift, his body grow tense, his face turn toward the tower, as if hearing a voice call his name. Holmes saw it too, and moved closer to Blackwood, placing a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of both support and restraint. The bells continued, their complex harmonies filling the stone space, resonating in the very bones of the building, and in the bones of the three men who listened. Watson found himself analysing the sound with the portion of his mind that remained clinical and detached. The bells were not producing discord, but rather an unfamiliar form of accord, intervals and progressions that didn't match Western musical tradition, but possessed their own logic and beauty. Was this what Grail had meant by the bridge of sound? A sonic structure that somehow altered consciousness or perception? The ringing continued, for what Watson's watch later confirmed was 27 minutes, growing longer still, approaching that climactic duration Grail had described for the final night. When the bells finally fell silent, the silence itself seemed to ring, as if the air had been permanently altered by the vibrations that had filled it. Blackwood remained kneeling, but his posture had changed. He was trembling slightly, and when he finally rose and turned to face his companions, his expression was one of wonder and terror mingled. "I felt it," he said, his voice hoarse. "The call that Grail wrote about. It's not words, nothing so simple as that. It's a pull, like standing at the edge of a great precipice and feeling both the fear of falling and the strange desire to step forward into space. It's as if something on the other side of somewhere is reaching out, trying to grasp me, draw me across a threshold I can neither see nor understand." Holmes guided him to sit in a pew. "Did you feel compelled to act, to go anywhere or do anything specific?" Blackwood shook his head slowly. "Not yet, or not exactly. It was more like being shown a door and being told that eventually I must choose whether to open it. The call isn't demanding immediate response, but it is building, growing stronger each night. I can feel it." They remained in the church a while longer, Holmes examining the chancel floor where the hidden chamber lay beneath, Watson staying close to Blackwood in case the Reverend needed medical attention. His pulse was elevated, his breathing shallow, classic signs of acute stress. Eventually, they returned to the vicarage as the first grey light of dawn began to show in the east. Over the next several days, they fell into a pattern of investigation and observation. During the daylight hours, Holmes conducted extensive research. He had Blackwood write to Lord Pemberton's descendant at Ravenswood Manor, requesting access to any papers or journals the old lord might have left regarding his work with Grail. He examined the church bells themselves again, this time looking for any unusual properties in their casting or construction that might account for their particular acoustic qualities. Watson, meanwhile, interviewed various villagers, gathering what folklore and local knowledge existed about the church and its history. Many of the older residents had stories passed down through families about strange occurrences, lights seen in the church at odd hours, the sense of presences in the building, occasions when the bells had rung unexpectedly. Most dismissed these as fancy or natural phenomena misinterpreted, but a pattern emerged. St. Dunstan's had always been regarded with a mixture of reverence and unease, as if even the most skeptical villagers sensed something indefinable about the place. Each night at 3 o'clock, they maintained their vigil in the church, witnessing the bells ring for durations that increased with mathematical precision. On the 24th night, 29 minutes. On the 25th night, 31 minutes. And with each night, Blackwood's sense of compulsion grew stronger, the pull towards some unseen destination becoming more difficult for him to resist. Holmes spent considerable time studying Grail's partial translation of the ancient text. He brought in his own knowledge of linguistics and symbology, consulting reference books he had requested be sent from London, working late into each night, attempting to verify or correct Grail's interpretations. Watson often found him in the study in the small hours, surrounded by papers, the ancient metal plates, which they had recovered from the sealed chamber beneath the chancel, laid out before him, his eyes red from strain, but gleaming with determination. On the morning of the 28th day, just one full night before the predicted culmination, Holmes emerged from his study with an air of grim satisfaction. He had, he announced, completed his analysis of Grail's translation and believed he had corrected several crucial points. Grail's interpretation was largely correct, Holmes explained as they gathered over breakfast. The text does describe a ritual of communion, a method by which the ancient priests of this place sought to communicate with, well, the text calls them those who have gone into the silence, which might mean the dead, or might mean something more abstract, spirits, ancestral wisdom, knowledge beyond the physical. The bells, as Grail understood, were central to creating the proper state of consciousness, the bridge of sound that enabled this communion. But here is where Grail made a critical error in translation, one that may have cost him his life, or his sanity, or whatever fate befell him. The word he translated as sacrifice, or offering, can also be read as exchange, or substitution. The ritual doesn't require someone to be sacrificed in the sense of being destroyed or consumed. Rather, it requires someone to serve as a medium, a bridge themselves between the physical world and this other realm the text describes. But, and this is crucial, it must be voluntary, and it must be someone who understands the purpose and accepts it willingly. Blackwood had been listening intently, his breakfast forgotten. So, Grail wasn't destroyed. He crossed over, became a bridge himself. That is my interpretation, Holmes confirmed. The text speaks of the Keeper of Bells, who, when the time is right and the bridge is called for, must choose to step into the role of mediator. Grail believed himself to be that keeper, and he chose to accept the role. What happened to him after that? Whether he literally disappeared into some other plane of existence, or whether he underwent a psychological transformation so complete that he could no longer function in ordinary reality, we cannot know. But the text is clear that this completion of the pattern happens only once per cycle. What cycle? Watson asked. How often does this occur? The text isn't entirely clear, Holmes admitted. There are references to periods of time that are difficult to translate. They seem to be based on astronomical phenomena, alignments of stars or planets. But if we take the previous occurrence as a guide, the cycle is approximately 100 years. Grail disappeared in December of 1800. We are now in December of 1900, 1 century exactly. The implications hung heavy in the air. Outside, clouds had moved in, and snow had begun to fall, soft flakes drifting down like cold blessings over the village and the ancient church. Tonight is the 28th night, Blackwood said quietly. Tomorrow night, the 29th, is when the pattern completes, if the sequence holds. What am I to do, Mr. Holmes? Am I meant to follow Grail's path, to offer myself as this bridge? Or am I meant to resist, to break the cycle somehow? Holmes's expression was grave. That, Reverend, is a decision only you can make. I can tell you what I have learned from these ancient texts, what I deduce from the evidence, but I cannot tell you whether to answer this call or refuse it. Both courses carry risks. If you answer and Grail's fate befalls you, you will be lost to this world and those who depend on you. But if you refuse, we don't know what consequences might follow. The text suggests that when the bridge is called for, it must be completed, or the boundary between worlds becomes unstable, leading to, the terminology is unclear, but it seems to suggest disorder, confusion, a bleeding through of one reality into another. Could we not simply leave? Watson suggested, practical as always. Blackwood could depart the village tonight, be far away when 3 o'clock arrives tomorrow. Without the keeper present, surely the ritual cannot complete. Perhaps, Holmes said, but the compulsion Blackwood has been feeling is strong and growing stronger. Could he truly resist it? And more fundamentally, should he? These ancient peoples built this tradition for a reason, maintained it across centuries. Perhaps there is genuine value in what they sought to achieve: knowledge, wisdom, connection with something beyond our ordinary understanding. They spent the day in deep discussion and contemplation. Blackwood prayed for guidance, walked the grounds of his church, spoke with some of his parishioners who had noticed his distraction and worry, and offered their concern. Holmes continued to study the texts, searching for any additional insight that might help clarify what would happen when the 29th night arrived. Watson, finding himself unable to help in more concrete ways, simply remained close to both his companions, offering whatever support his presence could provide. That night, the 28th night, they gathered in the church as usual. The snow had continued throughout the day, and the world outside was transformed, muffled and white, the silence deeper than usual. When 3 o'clock came and the bells began to ring, their sound seemed to carry both across the snowy landscape and inward into the deepest recesses of consciousness. Watson watched Blackwood carefully and saw the Reverend's entire body strain toward something. Not toward the tower, but toward some direction that had no physical orientation, as if he were a compass needle pointing toward magnetic north. Except his north was in a dimension perpendicular to the ones they ordinarily inhabited. The ringing continued for 33 minutes, and when it ceased, Blackwood was weeping silently, tears streaming down his face. "I understand now," he said when he could speak. "I understand what they want, what Grail must have understood. They're not demanding sacrifice or seeking to harm. They're asking for help, for connection, for someone to remember them and acknowledge that they existed, that their understanding and wisdom mattered. The dead, or the ancestors, or whatever they are. They're calling out across time, asking not to be forgotten, asking for communion with the living world they once inhabited. And the keeper, the vicar, the one who tends this sacred place, they're asking him to serve as that connection, to be the voice that speaks for them and the ears that hear them." Holmes moved closer. "And will you answer, tomorrow night, when the pattern reaches completion?" Blackwood was silent for a long time, his face illuminated by the soft glow of their lanterns, shadows playing across his features. "I don't know," he finally said. "I truly don't know. Part of me wants to fulfill this ancient role, to be part of something larger than myself, to bridge the gap between past and present, between the living and the dead. But part of me is simply a frightened man who doesn't want to disappear, who values his life and his work and the simple pleasures of existence in this world. Then we will wait until tomorrow night, Holmes said gently, and when the moment comes, you will decide. That is all any of us can do. Face the moment as it arrives and choose according to our best understanding and truest nature. They returned to the vicarage through the falling snow, and what little remained of the night passed in restless sleeplessness for all three of them. The day that followed, the 29th day, moved with strange elasticity, hours seeming both to race past and to stretch endlessly. Meals were prepared and eaten without tasting. Conversation drifted and died. Holmes attempted to read, but found himself staring at the same page without comprehension. Watson cleaned his service revolver, though what good a gun would be against invisible forces calling across centuries, he couldn't say. The familiar ritual simply gave his hands something to do. Blackwood spent much of the day in the church alone, and when he returned in the late afternoon, his face was calm with the peace of decision made, though he didn't speak of what that decision was. They shared a simple supper, then dressed warmly and walked through the twilight to St. Dunstan's one final time. The church seemed to be waiting for them, its ancient stones patient as they had been patient through wars and plagues and the slow turning of seasons across 900 years. They entered and took their positions, and now the wait began, the final wait before the mystery would either resolve or deepen beyond their ability to comprehend. Watson found his mind wandering to thoughts of mortality and meaning, of the brief span allotted to individual humans, and the way we strive to create connections that outlast that span. These ancient people whose shrine lay beneath the church floor, they had been dead for millennia, their names lost, their faces forgotten, their language barely decipherable. And yet, through bells and stone and ritual, they were reaching out still, refusing to surrender entirely to oblivion. Wasn't that what all humans did in their various ways? Create art and music and literature and children, build structures and institutions, leave marks upon the world that said, however quietly, I was here, I mattered, remember me. The hour approached. Holmes stood near Blackwood, not constraining, but ready to provide whatever support or intervention might prove necessary. Watson remained in the pews, an observer of events beyond his medical expertise, to heal or hinder. 3 o'clock arrived. The bells began, but tonight they were different. Fuller, richer, the sound so textured and complex that it seemed less like 6 bells ringing than like an entire carillon, 100 bells or 1,000, their voices weaving together into something that transcended mere sound and became something else entirely. Watson felt the vibration in his chest, in his bones, in his teeth. The air seemed to thicken, to develop a quality like water, and through it the sound moved in visible waves, distorting the space around them. Blackwood stood transfixed, his arms slightly extended, his face turned upward. Holmes remained beside him, one hand reaching toward his friend, but not quite touching, respecting whatever was unfolding. The sound built and built, layer upon layer, until Watson thought he could actually see it. Luminous threads of vibration, connecting the bells in the tower above, to the ground below, to the hidden chamber beneath, to the stones themselves, creating a web or network of sound that encompassed the entire structure. And at the center of that web stood Blackwood, the focal point, the keeper whose choice would determine what happened next. Watson became aware of presences in the church, not physical bodies, but something else. Essences or consciousness that had no corporeal form, but were nonetheless undeniably present. He could not have described them if asked, could not say how many there were or what they looked like, only that the church was full of them, filled with ancient awareness, focusing intently on the moment unfolding. The bells rang on. 5 minutes, 10, 15, climbing toward what would surely be the longest duration yet. Blackwood's lips moved, though Watson couldn't hear his words beneath the overwhelming sound. The Reverend seemed to be conversing with someone or something, responding to communication Watson could not perceive. Then, at what must have been nearly 40 minutes of ringing, Blackwood's form began to change. Not dramatically. He didn't vanish or transform into something inhuman, but he became somehow less solid, more translucent, as if he were fading from this world into another frequency of existence. Watson started to rise, alarm flooding through him, but Holmes's hand gesture stopped him. Wait, observe, let it unfold. The bell's sound shifted, modulating into something that, impossibly, sounded like joy, pure, transcendent joy. Blackwood's face reflected that emotion, his expression one of wonder and peace. He was still visible, still technically present, but he was also clearly somewhere else, existing in multiple states or locations simultaneously. Then he spoke, and though his voice should have been inaudible beneath the ringing, it came through clearly, as if broadcast on a different channel that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to consciousness. I understand, I accept, but not as Grail did, not by leaving entirely. I will be the bridge, but I will remain rooted in both worlds, 1 foot in the physical, 1 in the realm of memory and spirit. I will be the keeper in the truest sense, maintaining the connection, but not abandoning those who depend on me. If you can accept this compromise, this middle path, then I am yours. The quality of the sound changed again. Watson would later describe it as sounding like agreement, like acceptance, like a contract sealed. Blackwood's form solidified once more, becoming fully present and visible. But something had changed in him. Some essential quality had been altered. His face held a gravity and depth it had not possessed before, and his eyes, when they opened fully and focused on his companions, seemed to see through multiple layers of reality simultaneously. The bells began to fall silent, one by one, each voice fading until only the smallest remained, its bright tone ringing alone in the stone space. Finally, it too ceased, and silence rushed in, but this time the silence felt complete, resolved, like the silence after a great symphony ends, when the final chord fades and the audience sits stunned before the applause begins. Blackwood swayed slightly, and Holmes and Watson both rushed forward to support him. They guided him to sit in a pew, and he looked up at them with a faint smile. "I'm still here," he said softly, "still myself, but also more than myself, or perhaps myself plus others. I carry them with me now, the ancient keepers, the wisdom they accumulated, the memories of this place. I am the bridge, but I have not crossed entirely over. I remain here to serve both the living parishioners who need a vicar and the dead who need someone to remember them." "What did you see?" Watson asked, unable to contain his curiosity. "What exists on the other side of that bridge?" Blackwood's eyes grew distant. Not a place, exactly. More like a state of being, a realm of pure consciousness and memory. All those who have ever held this place sacred, from the ancient priests to Grail himself, they exist there in some form. not as individuals exactly, but as a collective awareness, a repository of understanding and wisdom. They wanted connection with the physical world, with ongoing human experience, to remain relevant and remembered, and they needed someone willing to serve as the conduit for that connection. He looked at the altar, at the simple cross there. "I don't think this contradicts my Christian faith," he said, almost to himself. "It exists alongside it, or perhaps beneath it, the older stratum upon which the newer was built. All of it is part of the same human yearning toward the divine, toward connection with something beyond our individual mortality. I can serve both traditions, honor both the ancient ways and the newer understanding that grew from them." They sat in the church a while longer, none of them quite ready to leave this place where something profound and strange had occurred. Eventually, as the eastern sky began to lighten toward dawn, they rose and made their way out into the snowy morning. The village would wake soon, and life would continue. Blackwood would prepare for Sunday services. Villagers would go about their daily work. The world would turn as it always did. But something had changed. Some ancient pattern had been completed, and peace had been made between past and present, between the living and the dead. Over the following days, Holmes and Watson remained in Ravenswood to observe and ensure that Blackwood was truly well, that the transformation he had undergone was stable and beneficial rather than harmful. They witnessed him conducting services with a new depth and eloquence, speaking of continuity and connection, of honouring both ancient wisdom and present faith. The villagers, who had been frightened and suspicious during the weeks of mysterious bell ringing, responded to the change in their vicar. They couldn't articulate what was different, but they felt the new peace in the church, the sense that something long troubled had been resolved. The bells of St. Dunstan's rang at their proper times now, calling the faithful to worship, marking births and deaths and weddings. Their voices joyful and clear, with no hint of the eerie melancholy that had characterized the phantom ringings. The pattern had been completed. The bridge had been built, and it would hold for another century at least, maintained by a keeper who understood his dual role. On their final morning in Ravenswood, Holmes and Watson walked with Blackwood through the churchyard, among the ancient stones that marked the resting places of centuries of villagers. Snow still covered the ground, though the weather had warmed slightly, and icicles hanging from the church's eaves dripped steadily, marking time in liquid percussion. "Will you write about this, Watson?" Blackwood asked. "Will you share what happened here?" Watson considered. "I will record it," he said. "Whether I publish it, I'm not certain. It's not like our usual cases. There's no criminal to expose, no injustice to correct. It's something else entirely." "It's a mystery, nonetheless," Holmes said. "One that we have, in our fashion, solved. We understand now what the bells represented, what Grail discovered, what the ancient text described. The fact that the solution involved accepting, rather than preventing the phenomenon, doesn't make it less of a resolution." They stood at the church wall, looking back at St. Dunstan's tower, rising against the pale winter sky. "Thank you," Blackwood said simply, "for coming, for staying, for bearing witness. I couldn't have navigated this alone. I might have made Grail's choice, to cross over completely, or I might have fled in fear. Instead, with your presence and support, I found a middle path." "You found it yourself," Holmes replied. "We simply stood nearby while you made the journey. That is all we could do in the end. Be present for the mystery, rather than masters of it. Some things are beyond our power to control, and the wisdom lies in recognizing which things those are. They returned to London that afternoon, the train carrying them back through the winter landscape toward the familiar streets and rooms of the city. As they settled into their compartment, Watson found himself already mentally composing how he would record this adventure. The phantom bells, the ancient wisdom, the vicar who became a bridge between worlds. I am, Watson admitted, though I'm not sure I can do it justice. How does one convey in words an experience that transcended the physical, that touched on realms we have no adequate language to describe? You will manage, Holmes said, with a slight smile. You always do. You have a gift for making the extraordinary seem real, and the impossible seem merely improbable. And perhaps that is appropriate. What we witnessed in Ravenswood was not truly impossible, merely unprecedented in our personal experience. Somewhere in the vast complexity of existence, there is room for ancient wisdom and phantom bells, for bridges between worlds and keepers who maintain them. The train rattled onward through the fading afternoon. Watson took out his notebook and began to write, capturing details while they remained fresh, knowing that even as he wrote, some essential quality of the experience would slip through the nets of language like water through a sieve. But he would try nonetheless, because that was what he did. He witnessed the adventures, recorded the mysteries, preserved the memories for those who would come after. The mystery of the phantom bells had been solved, not through clever deduction alone, but through courage, curiosity, and the willingness to accept that some things lie beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. And perhaps, Watson reflected, as he wrote by lamplight, while the train carried them home, that was the most important lesson of all, that the world contained more wonders than philosophy typically dreamed of, and that sometimes the wisest course was not to explain the mystery away, but to honor it, to serve it, to let it expand one's understanding of what was possible. Outside the train window, the English countryside rolled past in darkness, ancient fields and forests that had witnessed countless human dramas across millennia. And somewhere in that darkness, in a small village in Sussex, church bells hung silent in their tower, waiting for their next proper summons, their phantom voices stilled, now that the keeper had accepted his calling, and the bridge between worlds had been secured for another generation. The adventure was complete, the mystery resolved, and two travellers were heading home to Baker Street, where new cases and new mysteries would eventually call them forth again. But for now, in this peaceful moment between adventures, Watson wrote, and Holmes smoked, and the train carried them through the night toward whatever future awaited them. And so, our story comes to its gentle close, dear friend. The phantom bells have been stilled, their mystery understood, and their ancient purpose fulfilled. Reverend Blackwood stands as keeper between worlds. Holmes and Watson return to their familiar rooms, and the great wheel of time turns onward as it always does, carrying us all toward destinations known and unknown. I hope this tale has helped ease your thoughts toward rest, that the mystery has engaged your mind gently without creating anxiety, and that the resolution has brought you a sense of peace and completion. Sometimes the greatest mysteries are not those we solve by pure logic alone, but those we solve by opening ourselves to wonder, by accepting that existence contains more dimensions than we typically perceive, and by having the courage to stand in the thin places where boundaries blur and impossible things become real. If you've enjoyed this journey to Christmas in Ravenswood, to the ancient bells and the bridge between worlds, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to this channel and like this video. Your support allows me to continue creating these long-form sleep stories, these gentle mysteries that help ease us toward peaceful rest. There are more tales waiting to be told, more gaslit streets to wander, more Gothic mysteries to unravel, more Victorian adventures to experience in the borderlands between waking and dreaming. But for now, settle deeper into your comfort. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen, and let yourself drift. The bells are silent, the mystery is solved, and all is well in the ancient church in Sussex, and in the wider world beyond. Peace has been made between past and present, between the living and the dead, and you can rest knowing that somewhere, always, there are keepers who maintain the bridges between worlds, who honor the ancient wisdom while embracing the present moment. Good night, dear traveler. May your dreams be peaceful, your rest be deep, and may you wake refreshed and renewed. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. Until we meet again in another story, sleep well.